The theme of this session is about the transformative power of forgiveness and what forgiveness means, who has the right to forgive, how important is forgiveness in terms of reconciliation. Each of our contributors have very interesting but different stories to tell. So I think it would be important that you as the audience think about what they have told you and has it challenged your view of forgiveness. And I think what we would hope is in the end we may come to some sense of where forgiveness is in terms of the Northern Ireland conflict in particular. So I'm going to ask Richard Moore to start off with his kind of 10-minute introductory talk telling us about his own experience.
Okay, thank you, Derby, and good evening, everybody. It's great to be in Coventry as well, and delighted to be here, and especially to share the panel with Stephen and Deirdre and Joe as well. I come from Derry, Londonderry, and I was born in 1961. I lived in Derry all my life, and so I remember Derry and Northern Ireland before the conflict. But when I was around 8 or 9 years of age, for me, everything suddenly changed. I lived in the Cregan estate in Derry, which would be, I suppose, fair enough to say it was a Catholic nationalist area, just run up from the Bogside. And, so what I remember was, as a child, what seemed to be overnight, the Cregan became like a war zone. There was bombings, there were shootings, there was riots on a daily occurrence, there was police and military gear, there was army, soldiers, Land Rovers, Saracens, all that sort of stuff. And there were barricades at the end of each street, burnt out cars, burnt out buses. So it felt, smelt and looked like a war zone. And Cregan and the Bogside became, like some areas in Northern Ireland, officially known as a no-go area. In 1972, you had Bloody Sunday, which was January 1972, which happened in Derry, and where 13 people were shot dead by the British Army. And I'm sure at least 3 or 4 of those people lived within 30 seconds walk from my house. So as you can imagine, Derry, Northern Ireland, was a fairly volatile place. I went to Rosemount Primary School, and Rosemount Primary School was on the edge of the Cregan estate, and it was beside the secondary school. And beside the 2 schools was a police barracks, an RUC police barracks. And because of where the police barracks was located at the edge of a no-go area, it was a target for the IRA, and it was a target for rioters on an almost daily basis. So eventually the British Army were brought in to protect the barracks. And one of these army lookout posts was positioned at the bottom of our school playground. So on the 4th of May 1972, about 4 months after Bloody Sunday, I got out of school as normal, and as I ran up along the bottom of the football pitch, a British soldier fired a rubber bullet. The rubber bullet hit me here in the bridge of the nose. I lost this eye and was left completely blind in my left eye. So I'm blind now about 44 years. But to be honest, I bounced back reasonably quick from the incident. It was about a month after I was shot that my brother Noel told me that I would never be able to see again. And to be honest with you, I accepted it like that. I literally took it in my stride that day. Until I went to bed that night, when I was in bed on my own, I cried for the one and only time that I remember about blindness. And I cried because I realised for the first time that I was never going to actually see my parents again. And I suppose to a 10-year-old boy, you don't think about the bigger things in life. You don't think about getting a job. You don't think about your education. You don't even think about how you're going to cope. As I say, all I felt was this enormous sense of loss, that I was never going to see my parents again. And I cried myself to sleep that night. But the next day, I got up and got out of bed and began to put the pieces of my life back together. And I would always say that day was the first day of the rest of my life as a blind person. So I eventually went back to school, the school I was at, went on to university, got married, have 2 children. I was compensated by the British government, so I bought a house with half the money and bought a pub with the other half. And 2 years later, I bought a second pub. So when I came out of university, I went straight into running my own business. I had an office above one of the pubs, and I became a director at Derry City Football Club. I learned how to play the guitar and played in bands and all that sort of stuff. You know, and the reason why I'm sort of briefly telling you all of that, taking you on a very quick journey through my life, was because I use that in many ways to acknowledge the things in my life that allowed me to accept blindness. And not only see blindness as something to cope with, but to see blindness as a positive experience. I actually don't mind being blind. There's some benefits about being blind. When you look at your man here on my left, then I'm thankful I don't have to look at him. So, mind you, he'll tell you a story about my shirts later, but we'll not go into that, Stephen. But, you know, I would see, you know, like to acknowledge the things in life that made it possible for me not only to cope with blindness, but accept it. And I think it's a number of things. I come from a good family. I come from a good community. I also had opportunities available to me. I was able to go back to school and get an education. And I suppose during my self-employed years, I became very conscious of those issues. So eventually I sold out the business and I set up a charitable organisation called Children in Crossfire that today work in Tanzania and Ethiopia, and we work with some of the most vulnerable children on the planet. And you know, another very important thing, a very significant thing about my story is the fact that I never had any anger or any hatred towards the British Army or towards the soldier. And you know, I mentioned Bloody Sunday. My mammy's brother was shot dead on Bloody Sunday, my Uncle Gerard. And then 4 months later, I was blinded. And you know, the fact that I didn't have any anger or any bitterness had very much to do with my parents and their view on life. And to the point where I wanted to meet the British soldier that shot me, but I never knew his name until, you know, 33 years after I was shot. And his name's Charles. And that was 2006 when I found out his name, or 2005 when I found out his name. And I went to Scotland in 2006 and met Charles for the first time. And you know, to sit in a hotel foyer, you know, at a table opposite the man that blinded me for life and caused all those hurts to me and my family all those years ago was an incredible experience. And you know, when you think about forgiveness, or when you think about anger, anger is like, for me, is a self-destruct emotion. It's like somebody once described it like anger is like drinking a cup of poison and expecting the other person to die. And I'm glad I didn't have that. And as I say, the day I met Charles, it was one of the most amazing days of my life. And I learned two things about forgiveness that day. The first thing is, forgiveness is first and foremost a gift that you give to yourself. And what I mean by that is, forget about Charles. If he wants my forgiveness, he has it. But that's not what's important. What's important for me and here, for my happiness, for my peace of mind, that I forgive Charles. So forgiveness isn't about the other person. It's about yourself. The second thing I learned about forgiveness is, it doesn't change the past, but it does change the future. The fact that I forgive Charles won't give me back my eyesight. Won't take away all the hurts that were caused to me and my family all those years ago. But what it did do and has done is change my future. And I genuinely believe that I wouldn't be the person I am today, having the life that I've had, if I had been racked with anger, hatred, and bitterness. So I would always say, I am a victim of the Northern Ireland conflict, and there's nothing I can do about that. But I refuse to be a victim of anger, and there's plenty I can do about that. So I'll stop there now and hand it back to you, Deirdre. Is that okay? Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Richard. I think it's a very personal and a very powerful story of how forgiveness has helped you to deal with what many other people would find to be a trauma that they wouldn't be able to get over. And I suppose what we're thinking about here is how forgiveness relates to justice. And in Richard's case, we might come to ask him, is forgiveness unconditional, for example? Is forgiveness a choice? You seem to be certainly suggesting that it is a choice. But we'll move on at this stage to our second contributor, Joe Berry. Joe, over to you.
Thank you. November 2000. I'm sitting in a house in a suburb in Dublin. around a kitchen table, and I'm waiting for the doorbell to ring, and in to walk Patrick McGee, the only person who'd been held responsible for killing my father back in 1984. And I remember sitting there and thinking, all these years I've been wanting to not blame, wanting to not have an enemy, wanting to understand, but how am I going to feel when he walks in through the door? I was terrified, wondered whether I was going to regret it, but part of me wanted him to come so I could hear his story and see him as a human being. I remember him walking in, and I got up and I shook his hand and I said, "Thank you for coming." And he said, No, thank you for inviting me. We were really polite, and I knew I wanted to be in a room just with him for the first conversation. So we went into a little conservatory, and that first meeting was 3 hours. I remember him sharing his political justification of using violence, of seeing the Brighton bomb, of seeing that killing the Conservative Party was a good strategy. And actually, I was familiar with that. I'd met other men in the IRA, in Sinn Féin. I was prepared for that. But I was curious. Who was he? What was he behind that? What was he thinking, feeling? What happened to him to decide to choose violence? So I asked questions, and I also listened to him. And I shared about my experience of going to Belfast in 85 and 86, of me trying to find answers to the question of why my dad had been killed. And he listened very intensely, and he himself asked some questions. And I remember thinking, I've got what I want. I can see that he has some humanity, some sensitivity. But he is justifying killing my father, and I can never understand and accept that. But I've got what I want. I put the human face to the enemy. I have no longer an enemy. So I think I'm going to end it now. And at that point, he stopped talking, and he looked at me, and he rubbed his eye, and he said, "I don't know anymore who I am. I want to hear your anger and your pain, and what can I do for you?" And I knew in that moment he'd taken off his political hat and become vulnerable. And it was no longer just about my need, and now it was about his need. And part of me was terrified and wanted to run away because this was more than I'd bargained for. And part of me embraced this because this was a new journey. And the conversation carried on for another hour and a half, and it was very different. He became vulnerable and shared a lot more with me from his personal experience, no longer political. And I was also listening to parts of myself which were finding it hard to be with him. And so after about another hour and a half, I knew I couldn't listen anymore. And so I thanked him for coming. And he said, "I'm really sorry I killed your dad." And I remember going home very disorientated, because not only had I met the man who'd killed my father, but I'd seen his humanity. And it felt like I was betraying something very deep. But I knew I wanted to go back for more that was unfinished. And so I was back within a few weeks, and we carried on meeting. And the intensity continued, and I carried on learning. And I was learning about myself as well as about him. I remember one day we had a few hours walking in the Wicklow Mountains. I think it was probably raining. And he was sharing so much about what had happened to him. And I remember getting to a point of thinking, if I'd lived his life, if I'd been through everything he'd been through, what would I have done? And I don't know. And in that moment, it wasn't about forgiveness. It was just about that understanding. There was nothing to forgive. And I had that experience later on in that year at an amazing event that Richard was also at, where people came together to share stories. And I spoke to someone who'd been a British soldier and someone who'd been a Loyalist paramilitary. And hearing all the stories, someone being the RUC and all the different victim survivors, and recognising that when I really listened to their story, that there is no other, that there is no enemy, that there's only all of us struggling with our lives, with what we've been given, with our stories, trying to make sense and meaning and do our best. And so I'll end now by saying, for me, this is about empathy. It's about empathy that I now feel for Pat McGee, and he now feels for me, and also brings my dad back. When Pat planted that bomb, he didn't see any human beings. That's part of conflict. That's part of violent conflict, that we demonise the other. And now he knows he killed a wonderful human being. He knows he could have sat down and had a cup of tea with my dad. Now, the Conservative government weren't into having cups of tea with the IRA, we know that. But how much better if they had been having those cups of tea. And I can see the two of them together having that cup of tea. And in the end of the day, as Richard said, we can't change the past. But if we can change the future by making sure people are having those cups of tea, then we're creating a different future for our children. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, for a very powerful story. And we'll come back to you for some lessons after the initial discussion. But I suppose for me, the line that strikes me most in your talk is nothing to forgive. It's a very powerful statement. And also perhaps we might want to think about the power of apology, because you talked about having that apology. But hopefully that will give our audience something to think about whilst we listen to our final speaker, Stephen Martin. Stephen, you're welcome.
Good evening, everybody, and I'm delighted to be here, and also very humbling to follow Joe and Richard. So many things I would like to tell you about Richard, but because we go back a few years and good friends, and many stories about his dress sense. He's not too bad today, but that would be unfair.
That's because you didn't pick the clothes.
So, at the outset, I think it's important because of my professional role to say I'm here as an individual, and I'm not seeking to speak on behalf of the Police Service of Northern Ireland. I'll take a couple of minutes just to tell you a little bit about who I am, and then I suppose use my personal experience to talk around three areas. I suppose the internal struggles I've had, and then how when I've reconciled those, I've used those, I think, as a power for good in the relationships I've enjoyed professionally. And then I suppose the third issue I'll talk about is more of a rhetorical one, maybe laying a challenge to society. So first of all, Stephen Martin, I'm an Assistant Chief Constable in the Police Service of Northern Ireland. I've been a police officer for over 30 years, and I'm responsible on a day-to-day basis for all volume policing throughout Northern Ireland. So all the day-to-day police that you see out in patrol, going to the volume crimes. I've also responsibility for all parading issues and all hate crime issues across Northern Ireland. So it's quite a big job and quite a varied role. I joined the police as a young 18-year-old, so I'm nearly 49, 30 years in the police. I grew up in North Belfast in a unionist tradition. My father was in the Orange Order, but he was also a police officer. And there was nothing that I wanted to do other than be a police officer, following my father's footsteps and other family members. And when I was 18, I joined the police at the earliest possible opportunity. I had quite a working class background, and people who I went to school with, who I played with in the summer holidays and after school, went on to take other choices and join loyalist paramilitary groups, and ended up murdering people and going into prison for a very, very long time. And yet other people in the same classroom chose a different path and chose the type of path that I did. So as a young 18-year-old, I was sent to Richard's hometown, Derry, Londonderry. Very alien for me. It was a very difficult time. It was a highly militarised time. The threat and the risk was very, very significant. And in my first 3 months' introduction to the police, 3 of the officers in my station were murdered, 2 were blown up in a bomb, and 1 was shot dead, leaving his golf club. And I had to do duty at those 3 funerals in full uniform, slow march in front of the cortege as it travelled through the respective towns and behind the police band. So it was quite a difficult introduction to policing, and after 6 years in Derry as a constable, I moved on and started to go up the ranks. And then exactly midway through my career, 15 years into it, 15 years in the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the Patent Commission, which sort of came out of the all-party agreement, brought forward 175 recommendations that saw the RUC change. And one of those was that the RUC would change its name, its uniform would change. And I remember at that stage, midway through my career, being very sad and having internal struggles. Were the people, the wrong people winning? And I was profoundly sad. My father had since died, and the RUC crest was on his headstone, and here was the badge, the emblem, the title. The organisation had become a family to me, was, as I was seeing it at that stage, being cast aside for the wrong reasons. And I had a real challenge around that. I started to question how I would deal with that, because I believed in policing, and policing was much more important than the policing organisation, but the policing organisation had become very, very important. I was lucky at that time to be given the opportunity to go to Cambridge University for 10 weeks. And it was a development course, quite an academic course, and I wrote a piece around a truth recovery process for Northern Ireland and what that might look like. And as part of that, I spent a lot of time interviewing people and getting the opportunity to think about what I think. And thinking about what you think, often you don't get space to do that. And when you can step outside your day-to-day activity and engage with others, it can be profoundly helpful. And one of the groups that I spoke to at that time was a group called Healing Through Remembering. And when I came back from my course, I was asked to join them. And I remember being challenged, because I knew you can't expect everybody to change around you and not change yourself. Change has to start with you. And I knew that by joining that group, I would be meeting people who would have been, I suppose, people who I wouldn't have wanted to meet in the past. And I decided to join, and very quickly found myself sitting, having conversations with former IRA men, hunger strikers, former UVF men, people who had killed and murdered in the name of their cause. And that process, whilst I would never share their beliefs, it's very hard to retain anger for people who you get to know. You can still have disdain for the choices they made. You can still not agree with their beliefs. But when you get to know them as an individual, by first name terms, you get to know whether they're married, what football team they support, and you start to have conversations, it's very hard to retain anger and bitterness. And that process over a space of time allowed me to reconcile the issues that I had. I don't think I've ever forgiven anybody, unlike the previous 2 speakers. I don't honestly believe I've been a victim, as the previous 2 speakers have, although I'm sure being a police officer in Northern Ireland was a highly abnormal environment in which to police. And a lot of you could say the type of life I had to lead almost made me a victim, but I never felt that I was a victim, and I never felt that it was my place to forgive anybody. But I certainly reconciled myself that if I wanted to be part of a better Northern Ireland, then I had to let go with some of the difficulties that I was challenged with in terms of engaging with people who previously may have well seen me as a target. So once I had myself reconciled, the next thing I had to do was, well, how is that going to change the way I treat others and engage with others? And I was given a wonderful opportunity about 8 years ago, when I was promoted to the rank of Chief Superintendent and sent back to Richard's hometown in Derry. And as a Chief Superintendent, I was completely responsible for the policing of that city and the surrounding area. And I could have chosen to be quite a technical police officer, technocratic and safe, stick to catching criminals and crime prevention. Or I could actually try and be more than that, and be more than myself, I suppose, and try to focus on relationships, building trust, building trust and dealing with mistrust, which is entirely different thing, because I was still dealing and facing a lot of mistrust from the host community. And I set about doing that. And that opened up a whole wonderful world of new relationships and new possibilities to me. I became very convinced that the what of policing was important, but the how of policing was much more important. That people will long remember how you made them feel after what they remember you did for them. And actually making people feel that we were an impartial, professional, caring, compassionate police service that was for them and for everyone was one of the most powerful things I could do as a police commander in the city. I remember being invited up to the opening of a place called the Healthy Living Centre in Central Drive in Creggan by a man who Richard will know, Seamus Heaney, not the poet, obviously, another one. And I went up, and this was what previously would have been just a police commander in the city only a few years previously going to do that. You would have had troops in the street, helicopters in the air to protect you. And I went up with 2 other police officers, very low key, pair of jeans, shirt, and went in and mingled. A few people left on protest. But it was a wonderful, enriching experience. The next day, dissident-minded Republicans went up and attacked the centre that I'd been in because I'd been in it, and protested outside it. But Seamus and the community rallied round and said no, he was welcome. And then I had an opportunity to repay that community. And the dots join up. A couple of years later, the city of Derry made a bid for a music festival, an Irish festival called the Flacul na Heron, biggest music festival in Europe, biggest Irish festival in the world. And there were concerns that if it came north of the border, for the first time ever in its history from the Republic of Ireland, that there would be security concerns. And the people in the city asked me what I could do. So I went down to Dublin with a group from the city to speak to the organising committee the night before they were making the decision. And I worked the room, and I was honest and straight, and I told them that I would do everything I could to ensure that the festival passed off peacefully, unfettered by any disturbance, and that I would personally take charge for the entire week and stay in the city for the entire week that it was on to ensure that would happen. And they won the bid. Now, that was nothing to do with policing. I actually, as many people pointed out to me, put my head on the chopping block a little bit by doing that. But I knew it was socially important, economically important, culturally important for the people of Derry and the surrounding area. And here was an opportunity for me as a police commander not to give the technocratic answer, I can't guarantee safety. I give the, I suppose, the bolder answer and said I would do everything I could and would take personal leadership. And then when it came to policing the event, again, I could have put a ring of steel around the city. I could have had road stops and the bridges, and I could have had police officers in search activity. But I decided that there was nothing cultural in this, and this was all to do about a city of culture. So I had police officers on bicycles, I had police officers on foot patrol, and policing became part of the story for all the right reasons that week. All the right reasons. And I genuinely believe that effective policing of that nature can be a stepping stone to allowing people and assisting people along their journey in Northern Ireland, whereas policing that's slightly more technocratic, classic policing can actually be at times a stumbling block to that journey. So I've dealt with my internal self, I've dealt with the relationships, and I suppose the question I would leave with you is, how do we scale all that up? Individual acts of forgiveness that we've heard from Richard and Joe, individual, I suppose, acts of how someone like me discharges their responsibilities with an eye to the greater good rather than just the immediate task at hand. How do we scale that up? Northern Ireland, we have a past, and it's important to remember. We don't want to be constrained by that past. And we have but what we don't have is we don't have a shared understanding of that past. We have competing pasts. And it's how we overcome those competing pasts in a healthy way to allow us to move forward. Because I think most people would say, at a strategic sense, they know what they want. Want to live in a peaceful society. They want to live in a society where human rights are respected, people can be well educated. But at the moment, our past is getting in our way of that. And I still think that whilst much progress has been made, the past still has the potential to cause us difficulties. So thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, for your insights and your reflections on policing. And I suppose for me, your most challenging statement is you can't expect those around you to change and you don't change yourself. And you've also posed the question of who has the right to forgive and who is a victim in society. But what we are agreed on is that we are hoping that society in Northern Ireland can move forward, look towards a bright future. But what do we do about the past? Do we embrace the past? Can the past hold us back? Can we let go of the past? And some of the words that have come out from the talks that we've had have been around empathy, challenges, forgiveness, the importance of the future, the importance of an apology, whether we humanise people, how far do we demonise people, and the importance of reconciliation. So I think it might be useful just at this stage to ask our panellists one more question, and then I think we'll throw it out to the audience. But I suppose I would be interested to know, having listened to your stories and your own reflections, do you think that, for example, forgiveness and empathy is a conscious choice that you made? And what then are your views on people who say, well, I just can't forgive, I will never forgive, I can't move on? What would your views on that type of conversation be? I'll start with you, Jo.
Okay. I made a choice within 2 days of losing my father to go on this journey of healing and understanding. And it was a choice in which I didn't really know how I was going to do it, but I trusted I was going to find a way. And along the way, I've met people who've accused me of betraying my father, who said they can't forgive and don't want to. And as soon as someone says they can't forgive, then I move into listening gear. I move into, you've had a story. I can see that there's a lot going on. Do you want to share it? Because I really believe that we have to be listened to before we can move on. And I would never judge anybody for not being able to forgive. I think that transformational forgiveness, for me, actually is about being empathic. Because I know now when I feel empathy for someone, then I'm going to want to take action to make sure their needs are met in the same way the needs for my loved ones are. So the transformational part is about creating a world where we listen to people's voices, where no one is demonized, where we bring empathy into our politics. And I truly believe that if we are empathic, it's actually impossible to use violence, to have a foreign policy which is based on weapons, to make money out of weapons and arms. And so I moved from the personal, which is about getting the support, getting the resources to move on from trauma, and that takes as long as it takes, to actually working on creating safe places for people to be heard, to changing how we resolve conflict, so that we eventually stop creating victims and break this cycle, which just carries on from generation to generation.
Thank you. Stephen, you talked about being a technocrat, and you could have been a technocrat. Do you think it was a conscious choice that you had come to as an individual to say that you were going to push forward and push the boundaries where you could?
Yes, absolutely. It was a conscious decision, and I think it was the right decision, and I felt very comfortable making it. But it was at the end of a journey that I had processed personally. I believe many of my colleagues wouldn't have been able to do what I did and wouldn't have wanted to do it. perhaps even would have seen it as too difficult, too emotional. Maybe that sense of betrayal that Joe referred to earlier could have come into that. So absolutely, I think it was a decision. And on the issue of forgiveness, I absolutely think that needs to be a personal choice. I think coerced forgiveness could just re-traumatize people and re-victimize people. And I think that was one of the flaws to South Africa, is that some people felt re-traumatized because they were cajoled, coerced to both issue an apology or forgive. And those things can only ever be meaningful if they are sincere, and if they come from if you're either giving them or receiving them, that you are sincerely giving them, and you believe and perceive the person to be saying it to you to really mean it. And I got that sense from Jo when she was describing what Patrick had said to her. And that's my whole difficulty with the word reconciliation. Reconciliation talks about the restoration of relationships, and it does conjure up issues of apology and forgiveness. And I just always worry when people say we need to reconcile, we need to do this, that it can be seen as something coercive, as opposed to something that's either spontaneous or arrives at the end of a process. Of course, we all want reconciliation, absolutely. But the process by which we get there, I think we just need to be so careful.
Thank you. Richard, you talked about, and very movingly, about going to bed and only crying once, and knowing that you wouldn't see your parents again. But you were a young child. To what extent do you think that you had a conscious choice at that stage to say that you were going to move on, that you wouldn't be defined by anger and bitterness, but in fact that you would move on?
I'm not sure entirely. I suppose I sometimes think about where I was very anxious that people wouldn't see me as a blind person. I had this ridiculous experience where I refused to carry a white stick, for example, at 10 years of age. But I was happy to walk down the street tapping a fishing rod. And I guess you think, well, how odd does that look? But so in that respect, but what was it within me that created a thought process that I refused to be seen as something different, first of all. And I think that's not to do with being shot, I think it's not to do with conflict or anything. But there was something there that I just can never fully explain. But I never made a conscious decision to forgive. I discovered forgiveness probably around 2000 when I heard His Holiness the Dalai Lama speak in an event in Derry, and I remember thinking, he's describing how I feel, and it all started to twist for me. So I think for me, my ability to accept it all was down to a number of things, and blindness, as I say, became a positive experience almost immediately. I always joke and say, if you're a young boy from a nationalist area in Derry and you're meant to lose your eyesight, there's no better way to lose it than being shot by the Brits. Because overnight you're a hero. And in a strange kind of a way, that helped me. The fact that it was popular, the fact that I got a lot of attention, the fact that, that I felt that it was important for a while. And it got me over those initial stages. So the first thing is blindness wasn't a real big issue for me in the early times. But a pretty soldier did blind me. My eyesight was taken away, and every step, every day of my life, I've had to cope with blindness, not seeing my children. There's still times in my life today that I think about not seeing my children, and I would love to be able to see them. When my mother died last year, the memories is all I have. I don't have the photographs to look at and things. So that's a legacy of violence, that's a legacy of war, that's a legacy of blindness. Stephen there mentioned, forced forgiveness. I don't think you can force forgiveness. I don't think that's I think it's a big mistake. I would hate anybody in the audience or anybody ever listening to me or any of us talking, they feel that they're less person because they can't forgive. Because that's not, I don't think we could expect that from any victim. The only reason why I talk about forgiveness is because if there are victims out there who are struggling to find a way that they can deal with this hurt in their life, whatever it is, then forgiveness is a possible avenue. And to realise that forgiveness is not about the other person. It's not about justifying what they did. It's not about saying it's okay what they did. It's about you finding a way that you can deal with what happened inside you. And I've used him being sorry as well. Like Charles, for example, the soldier, never said sorry to me until 6 years after we met. I didn't ask him to apologise. I didn't feel he needed to apologise. But when he did apologise, it was nice. And the reason why it was nice is because I never asked for it.
On a personal reflection, certainly Richard would be well known throughout Northern Ireland, UK and the world, and is deemed to be a role model because, as I say, he could have reacted in a very different way. And just like he said, he was influenced by the power of the Dalai Lama. I don't want to embarrass him, but I think his talks have certainly influenced many people in Northern Ireland, and they've looked at what he's gone through and what he has decided to do about it, and they have then started to think about their own circumstances, their own viewpoint, their own stereotypes, their own prejudice. I can say that Richard was given an honorary degree at Ulster University, and we've had many pop stars and soap stars and sports managers, and he was the only one in my memory that got a spontaneous standing ovation because people were very moved, not by his story of his personal circumstances, but what he has achieved since and his views about reconciliation. So there, on an individual level, there's always the power of a role model, the power of looking at someone, listening to someone like Joe and Stephen saying, well, they had choices. You might say individuals can't make a difference, but how do we scale up unless we look at people and understand that they have made choices to move forward?
Society in Northern Ireland over the last 20 years has attempted on a number of occasions to try and stimulate how we would address the past with Lord Eames and Dennis Bradley, and that had much to commend it. But it was derailed over an acknowledgement payment to all victims. There was previous work done by Sir Kenneth Bloomfield, former head of the Civil Service, and now, on the back of something called the Fresh Start Agreement, the current Secretary of State and the political parties are advanced stages of trying to bring forward new legislation to address. Even picking the verbs difficult. Do we deal with the past, address the past, resolve the past, explore the past? It's hugely complicated stuff, and it's even made more complicated because of the number of victims, because of the emotion, because of the competing requests of victims. Some victims will forgive. Other victims want justice. Other victims want to see the people who visited damage and injury on their loved ones, in jail. Others just want to know, were they on their own when they died? What were their last words? And there's all these vast array of requirements and needs. I'm a great advocate of information retrieval. If anybody has an answer to a question that will give someone peace and contentment, then it behoves all of us to do our best to try and give an answer to that question. I'm not a great believer personally in a punitive or judicial exploration of the past. I think that's much less likely to be successful and much more likely to get bound up in legalities and people seeking to withhold information, and that's the opposite. But that's a personal view.
But also, Stephen, I think what you're saying is that human emotions are transient. So at some stage in your life, you might just want an answer. Then when you have an answer, you might say, well, now I want justice. And maybe at another stage, you might think, well, I want retribution. So it's a very complex emotive issue because you're not going to stay in the same place throughout your life.
And we've seen that with some of the significant inquiries. We have seen people start out saying, just as you've described, they just want answers to questions, they want the truth. But that can change to wanting people to face justice and people to be placed before the courts. And of course, when you get to that point and lawyers kick in and the legalities kick in, then, and the other thing is people are dying. The troubles now, the ceasefires were in 94, the first IRA ceasefire, and then 96 with the second one, 20 years ago. There are people now in their 60s and 70s who were combatants in their 30s and 40s whenever the peace kicked in. So time's not in our favour either.
I agree. Sometimes we're very good at listening, but we just don't hear.
Well, I genuinely think, obviously, listening's very important. I think if all you want to do is talk, then, it's obviously, in the simplest of terms, a one-way process.
Yes.
And I also, one of the things that I learned, for example, when I met Charles, and, bringing it down to that human level is, I would have liked Charles. My narrative around the soldier, I didn't know who he was or anything about him for 33 years. So I had a narrative in my mind of an 18-year-old soldier, basically frightened to death at the edge of a no-go area. And Derry, when I discovered he was a 34-year-old captain, when he shot me. And, I met an army officer who was very confident. I always say I didn't want to meet a man who was a gibbering wreck. I didn't want to meet somebody whose life was destroyed because of what he did to me. And I got exactly what I asked for. I didn't meet a gibbering wreck. I met a man who was very confident and very comfortable with what happened that day. And, and what I learned was, you have to, if you want to reconcile, if you want to bring anything forward, then first of all, it's extremely difficult. But you have to meet people where they're at. I can't say that I would like Charles to be this type of person. I would like him to be what I would like him to be. So that's the first thing I would say. Any reconciliation process is about meeting people where they're at. In many ways, Joe talked about that in relation to meeting Patrick McGee and stuff. She met a man, she took him where he was at. And if I had laid down preconditions, I would have never got an apology from Charles. I would have never had the relationship with Charles, I believe, that we have now. In relation to the bigger picture, really, what you're talking about in terms of Syria and all that, I'm delighted to hear you saying that. There is a voice there. There is a narrative that the world has been sold, and then there is a real story of suffering and that type of thing. And I just think that's being totally lost. And until we engage with suffering and empathise in a way that it's not about whose side you're on, then we're never going to really reach the place where you're going to have proper peace or a proper reconciliation to any of those issues.
Thank you, Richard. Joe, you wanted to come in on that?
Well, I agree with all that Richard said, and I'll add to that I think every time when we feel ourselves, when listening to the media or reading papers, that we are drawn to one side against another side, then we have to have an antennae that goes, what's happening right now? Because the truth is that when we feel closer to one side, we aren't hearing those of the other. Because there are no sides, there just are stories from many, many different perspectives. And right now we're not hearing all the stories from Syria, as Andrew just said. And I think it's up to all of us to find out those stories, to reach out to people, to listen, and then to share those stories around. It's partly what I do with my work. And going back to the question before, I believe we're all change makers, and we can't wait for our politicians to change. More than ever, we need to be the change. We need to create those safe places for people to share what's happening in their lives, those that aren't being listened to, those that are being marginalised, those who are finding their benefits being taken away, their houses being taken away. We need to listen to them. We need to listen to the people in the States who voted for Trump. We need to listen to those that voted for Brexit. And beyond our local picture, we need to reach out to those around the world. And to me, it used to be my focus in Northern Ireland, and I saw it as a shared responsibility. I saw that what was done in my name, in my past, I was responsible for. Now I feel that responsibility is the world, that we have a shared responsibility to peace in the world. And if there are people suffering in Syria, well, we know we're partly responsible for that. So it's up to us to bring the empathy and expand our hearts and be change maker and challenge our politicians, not in a way which takes away their dignity or demonises them in such a way they're going to hear. Pat often said that if I'd gone into that meeting arguing, I'm right, you're wrong, giving him reasons why he was wrong, he would have stayed in a place of righteousness. But because I listened, he had to move. So I believe we can challenge people so they can listen in a way which allows them the choice and their dignity. We need to bring all our skills of peace building and conflict transformation into that area of changing people's behaviour so they have choice to change. And we need to really address the terrible suffering that's going on in the world and know that we're partly responsible, and just in a way that if we understand the roots, then we can change it. And thank you, Andrew, for bringing those voices in the room that haven't been heard today.
Thank you. I'm getting a sign from the side to say that we need to wrap it up. We're actually over our hour. It just leaves me to say thank you very much to our three speakers, our three inspirational speakers, and I think we can agree as an audience that they have been change makers and show the power of the individual. And maybe Joe's right in our last comment that generally society is ahead of the politicians, and we just have to move forward with what we know is right, and people will come along with us. So thank you very much to all three of you.